Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Bible Paradox, where we explore the mysteries, truths, and nuances of the Scriptures. In today's video, we tackle a fascinating and complex topic: why is the Old Testament so brutal? Exploring the historical and cultural contexts. Join us as we delve into the historical, cultural, and theological aspects that shaped the narratives of the Old Testament. We will discuss the historical context of constant wars and territorial conflicts, the cultural practices of retributive justice and sacrificial rituals, and the theological purposes behind these passages. Understanding these passages can help us better understand the historical and cultural context in which they were written, as well as give us deeper insight into the message they convey. We will dive into three main aspects: the historical context, the cultural practices of the time, and the theological purpose of these passages. These elements are essential to understanding the brutality described in the Old Testament and the underlying messages these passages carry. And you won't want to miss the impactful examples we will discuss throughout the video. With that in mind, let's delve into the historical and cultural context that shaped these narratives and discover the lessons we can learn. Before we continue, I want to ask you to like this video and subscribe to the Bible Paradox. Your participation is essential to help our channel grow and reach more people interested in exploring the mysteries and truths of the Bible. Thank you very much for your support. To understand the brutality in the Old Testament, we first need to consider the historical context. The events took place in a period marked by constant wars and territorial conflicts among ancient nations. The survival and protection of the Israelite people often depended on military and defensive actions. During this period, battles and wars were an everyday reality, and violence was often necessary to ensure the security and prosperity of a people. Examples of historical battles include the conquest of Canaan, where the Israelites, under Joshua's leadership, took possession of the Promised Land by facing various peoples and fortified cities. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men." Joshua 6 verse 2. Another example is the struggle against the Philistines, which occurred repeatedly over the centuries, including famous confrontations such as the battle between David and Goliath. David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." 1 Samuel 17 verse 45. In addition to wars, it is important to remember that ancient societies had practices and codes of justice that may seem severe to modern eyes. The application of laws and the maintenance of order often involved physical and retributive punishments. However, these practices reflected the need for survival and the harsh reality of the times in which these texts were written. For example, the law of Talion, mentioned in Exodus 21 verse 24 as eye for eye, tooth for tooth, was a common form of retributive justice among ancient nations. This law aimed to limit vengeance and ensure that punishment was proportional to the crime committed. Additionally, the Israelites lived in a highly unstable geographic and political environment. The land of Canaan was located on a strategic route that connected great civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia. As a result, the region was often the scene of invasions and territorial disputes. To protect their land and ensure their survival, the Israelites often found themselves forced to take drastic measures. Another factor to consider is the social and tribal structure of the time. The Israelite tribes were united by kinship ties and alliances, and loyalty to the clan and tribe was paramount. The defense of honor and retribution for offenses were common practices, as the group's reputation and survival were at stake. The brutality in battles and punishments can be seen as an extension of this social system, where the protection of the group and the maintenance of order were absolute priorities. It is also important to recognize that many of the accounts of violence in the Old Testament have a theological and didactic purpose. They serve to illustrate the seriousness of sin and the need for justice and righteousness. The narratives of battles and punishments are often accompanied by explanations highlighting God's holiness and His aversion to iniquity and idolatry. When analyzing these passages, we must always take into account the context in which they were written. The Old Testament reflects a time and culture very different from our own, and it is crucial to understand these elements to correctly interpret the messages contained in it. The cultural practices of the time also played an important role in the brutality described in the Old Testament. The laws of talion, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, were common among ancient nations as a form of retributive justice. This law is mentioned in Exodus 21 verse 24, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. The intention behind this law was to ensure that punishment was proportional to the crime committed and, at the same time, to limit excessive vengeance. Sacrificial and punitive rituals were widely accepted as means of atonement and discipline. The sacrifice of animals, for example, was a common practice among the Israelites as a form of atonement for sins. In Leviticus 1 verses 3 to 4, we read about burnt offerings. If the offering is a burnt offering from the herd, you are to offer a male without defect. You must present it at the entrance to the tent of meeting so that it will be acceptable to the Lord. You are to lay your hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted on your behalf to make atonement for you. Additionally, purification rituals were also an essential part of the cultural and religious practices of the time. In Leviticus 14 verses 2 to 4, we find the instructions for the purification of a leper. These are the regulations for any diseased person at the time of their ceremonial cleansing when they are brought to the priest. The priest is to go outside the camp and examine them. If they have been healed of their defiling skin disease, the priest shall order that 2 live. Clean birds and some cedar wood, scarlet yarn and hyssop be brought for the person to be cleansed. These practices may seem strange and severe to modern eyes, but they reflected the cultural and religious reality of the time. Ancient societies valued order, justice, and purity, and these practices were seen as necessary to maintain harmony and the relationship with God. Besides the laws and rituals, the social and tribal structure played a fundamental role in how people lived and interacted. Loyalty to the tribe and clan was paramount, and the defense of honor and retribution for offenses were common practices. The application of severe and retributive punishments was a way to ensure order and justice within the community. When considering the cultural practices of the time, it is important to recognize that many of these actions were symbolically significant and had a didactic and theological purpose. They taught important lessons about justice, atonement, and God's holiness. The narratives of the Old Testament reflect this complex web of cultural, social, and religious factors that shaped people's lives in those times. What do you think about the cultural practices described in the Old Testament? Do you think they have any parallels with today's world? Leave your comment below. We would love to hear your opinion. Besides the historical and cultural contexts, we must consider the theological purpose of these passages. Many of the actions described in the Old Testament were interpreted as divine judgments against iniquity and idolatry. These passages serve as moral and spiritual lessons for readers, highlighting God's justice and holiness. A clear example of this is Noah's flood. In Genesis 6 verses 5 to 7, we read about the corruption and wickedness of humanity. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. The flood is described as an act of divine judgment, but also as an opportunity for a new beginning and the renewal of the covenant between God and humanity. Another significant example is the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. In Genesis 19 verses 24 to 25, we read, Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah, from the Lord out of the heavens. Thus, he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, destroying all those living in the cities, and also the vegetation in the land. These cities were known for their great iniquity, and their destruction is presented as a just and necessary judgment to eliminate corruption. At the same time, the narrative highlights the importance of justice and intercession, as seen in Abraham's attempt to save the cities in Genesis 18 verses 23 to 32. The Old Testament passages also serve as moral and spiritual lessons, emphasizing the need to live according to God's commandments and avoid idolatry and injustice. For example, in Deuteronomy 28, God establishes blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience, reinforcing the importance of following His commandments. If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all His commands I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations on earth. Deuteronomy 28 verse 1. These passages have a clear theological purpose: to demonstrate God's justice and His aversion to sin, as well as the need for repentance and obedience. They also offer hope and redemption, showing that God is willing to forgive and restore those who turn to Him with sincerity. Now, let's reflect on some common questions that arise when studying the Old Testament. Why did God allow so much violence? What lessons can we learn from these passages? These questions are deeply complex and have been the subject of debate among theologians and Bible scholars for centuries. One theological perspective is that the violence described in the Old Testament serves as a form of divine judgment against iniquity and idolatry. The theologian John H. Walton, in his book, The Lost World of the Israelite Conquest, argues that many of the violent narratives should be understood in the context of a just and necessary judgment to eliminate corruption and injustice. According to Walton, the conquest of Canaan was a divine action to purify the land of detestable practices and establish a kingdom of justice and holiness. Another interpretation is offered by Christopher Wright in the book, The God I Don't Understand. Wright suggests that the violence in the Old Testament should be seen as part of God's redemptive plan. He writes, "Divine judgment, though severe, is an expression of God's holiness and justice, and should be understood in light of His mercy and desire for redemption." Moreover, some scholars emphasize the importance of understanding the literary genre and theological purpose of the violent passages. Tremper Longman III, in his book, God is a Warrior, argues that the images of God as a warrior and the battle narratives are literary forms that communicate the seriousness of sin and the need for justice. Longman states that the metaphors of war and violence in the Old Testament should be seen as symbolic expressions of the struggle against evil and the defense of divine order. These perspectives help contextualize the violent passages and better understand the theological purpose behind them. However, it is important to recognize that these interpretations do not exhaust the complexity of the topic, and different theological traditions may offer other explanations. Ultimately, the violent passages of the Old Testament challenge us to reflect on the nature of divine justice and the relationship between God and humanity. They remind us of the seriousness of sin and the need to live in accordance with God's commandments, but also offer hope for redemption and renewal. Understanding the brutality in the Old Testament requires a multidimensional approach that considers history, culture, and theology. We hope this video has helped clarify some of the questions surrounding this complex topic. Leave your comment below with your reflections and questions. We would love to know what theme you would like to see explored in a future video. If your suggestion is chosen, we will honor you in the video by mentioning your name. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Thank you for watching the Bible Paradox. See you next time.